When I look back through the old manuscripts that contain my records of Sherlock Holmes, I am often struck by the difficulty of choosing between them. There were so many strange cases, so many quiet mysteries that unfolded in ways no ordinary man could have expected, yet some cases remain especially clear in my memory. The Adventure of a Golden Pince-Nez is one of them. It was a wild night toward the end of November. Holmes and I were sitting together in our rooms at Baker Street, each occupied with his own quiet work. Holmes was examining an ancient manuscript through a powerful lens, while I had settled down with a recent medical book. Outside, London seemed almost forgotten beneath the storm. The wind moved fiercely along Baker Street, and rain struck the windows with such force that conversation was hardly necessary. From time to time, I would glance toward the dark glass and see the faint glow of gas lamps reflected upon the wet pavement. There was something strangely comforting about remaining indoors on such a night. Holmes, for his part, seemed perfectly content. He had spent the evening studying a faded inscription on an old manuscript, and the work had demanded so much concentration that even he appeared ready to put it aside. At last, he rolled up the document and leaned back. The ancient writing, he had decided, was nothing more exciting than the accounts of an abbey from the 15th century. I remember thinking that we had probably seen the last of our work for the night. Then came the sound of a horse outside. The noise was unmistakable, even through the storm. Hoofs struck the street, followed by the long, grinding sound of wheels against the wet curb. A cab had stopped before our door. Holmes immediately became alert. For a moment he considered the possibility that someone had come to summon us into the terrible weather, but the cab soon moved away, leaving only the visitor behind. Holmes asked me to open the door. When the hall lamp fell upon our visitor, I recognized him at once. It was Stanley Hopkins, a young detective whose career Holmes had followed with considerable interest. He was soaked from the journey, and the expression upon his face told me that this was no ordinary visit. Holmes welcomed him upstairs, where the warmth of the fire quickly began to drive away the cold. Hopkins removed his wet coat, and we settled near the grate. There was little need for formalities. The young detective had come from Kent, and he had come because he was troubled by a case he could not understand. He had been called to Yoxley Old Place earlier that afternoon. The house stood some distance from Chatham and several miles from the railway. Hopkins had traveled there, examined the scene, returned to London, and then come directly to Baker Street. His investigation had given him facts. What he lacked was meaning. The case appeared simple at first. A young man had been murdered, yet the more Hopkins examined it, the stranger it became. The dead man was Willoughby Smith, a young university graduate who had been employed as secretary to an elderly scholar named Professor Coram. Professor Coram had lived at Yoxley Old Place for several years. He was an invalid and spent much of his time either in bed or being moved around the grounds in a bath chair. He had a reputation for learning and had devoted himself to a large scholarly work. His household was small. There was Mrs. Marker, an elderly housekeeper, and Susan Tarlin, a young maid. The gardener, Mortimer, was an old army pensioner who lived in a cottage at the far end of the grounds. Apart from these people and the unfortunate young secretary, there seemed to be no one else regularly connected with the house. It was an unusually isolated household. Weeks could pass without any of its members going beyond the garden gate. Willoughby Smith had been with Professor Coram for about a year. He was described as quiet, hard-working, and respectable. His earlier life gave no suggestion of enemies or troublesome companions, and yet, on that November morning, he had died violently. Professor's study. Hopkins then told us what Susan Tarleton had witnessed. The young maid had been working upstairs during the late morning. Professor Coram was still in bed, as he often was, when the weather was poor. Mrs. Marker was occupied elsewhere in the house. Willoughby Smith had been in his own room. Then Susan heard him walking along a passage and descending toward the study. She knew his footsteps well. A short time later, a terrible cry came from below. It was strained and hoarse, so unusual that Susan could not tell whether the voice belonged to a man or a woman. Almost immediately, there came a heavy thud, then silence. Susan hurried downstairs. She found the study door closed, and when she entered, she discovered Willoughby Smith lying on the floor. At first, there appeared to be no obvious injury. Then she saw the blood. A tiny but very deep wound had pierced the underside of his neck and severed the carotid artery. The weapon was lying nearby. It was a small sealing wax knife from Professor Coram's writing desk, an old-fashioned object with an ivory handle and a stiff blade. Susan had poured water over the young man's face, hoping that he might still be alive. For one brief moment, his eyes opened. He tried to speak. The words he uttered were confused, but unmistakable enough for Susan to remember them. He referred to the professor. Then came the words that would become one of the most important clues in the entire case. He said that it was she. After that, he raised his right hand, as though attempting to indicate something. Then he died. The housekeeper arrived moments too late to hear those final words. Professor Coram, meanwhile, had heard the cry from his bedroom. He was deeply agitated, but he insisted that he had not left his bed because of his condition. He required assistance to dress and move about. His gardener was not due to attend him until noon. The professor could offer no explanation for the young man's final words, nor could he suggest any reason why anyone should wish Willoughby Smith dead. There was another difficulty. There seemed to be no motive at all. No money had been stolen. No valuable object was missing. The household was small and closely contained, while no stranger had been reported in the neighborhood. Hopkins had examined the garden carefully. The recent rain had made the path soft enough to preserve footprints, yet there were no clear tracks. Someone had, however, passed along the narrow strip of grass beside the path. The grass had been pressed down. Whoever had come to the house had deliberately avoided the wet path, apparently taking great care not to leave footprints. The garden gate stood only about 100 yards from the main road, and it was not locked. A person could easily enter the grounds without being noticed. The difficulty was that the tracks gave no indication of whether the stranger had been coming or going. By then, I could see Holmes becoming increasingly attentive. He asked very few questions, but every detail seemed to settle somewhere in his mind. Hopkins continued. Inside the house, the corridor leading to the study was covered with coconut matting. No useful footprints had been left there. The study itself was simply furnished. There was a large writing table with a fixed bureau. The drawers were normally left open, while a small central cupboard was kept locked because it contained important papers. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Willible's body had been found close to the bureau. The wound had been made from behind, making suicide almost impossible. The knife itself had been found some distance from the body. Everything suggested that another person had been present. Then Hopkins produced the final object. He carefully unfolded a small packet and placed its contents before Holmes. It was a golden pince-nez. 2 broken pieces of black cord still hung from it. Willoughby Smith had possessed excellent eyesight. There was little doubt that he had seized the spectacles during a struggle with his attacker. Holmes took them into his hands. For several moments he examined them without speaking. He looked through the lenses. He studied their shape and construction. He held them toward the light. Then he examined the small fittings with extraordinary care. I watched him with growing curiosity. Holmes eventually took a sheet of paper and wrote a short description of the person he believed had worn the glasses. He handed it to Hopkins. The description was remarkably precise. The owner was almost certainly a well-dressed woman. She would have a broad nose, closely set eyes, a puckered forehead, and rounded shoulders. Her eyesight was extremely poor, and she had probably visited an optician more than once in recent months. Hopkins was astonished. I confess that I was little less surprised. Holmes, however, regarded the deduction as almost elementary. The glasses were delicate and beautifully made. Their golden frames suggested a woman of some refinement. More importantly, the clips were unusually wide. Holmes concluded that their wearer must have had a broad nose, while the great strength of the lenses indicated severe short-sightedness. The physical characteristics caused by such long-standing poor vision could, he explained, be seen in the forehead, eyelids, and shoulders. There was even evidence that the woman had visited an optician twice. One small piece of cork on the frame was old and worn, while its companion was comparatively new. The damaged piece had evidently been replaced. The two pieces matched so closely that Holmes believed the woman had returned to the same optician. It was another small detail, but in Holmes's hands, even the smallest detail seemed capable of becoming a road toward the truth. Still, one great question remained. Who was this woman? And why had she entered the isolated house at Yoxley Old Place? Hopkins had already made inquiries in the surrounding area, but no stranger had been identified. There was no apparent motive for murder, only the golden pince-nez, the dying man's strange words, and the faint traces in the wet grass seemed to connect the unknown woman with the crime. Holmes agreed to travel with Hopkins the following morning. We would take an early train from Charing Cross and continue our journey toward Yoxley Old Place. The storm outside gradually weakened, and Baker Street became quiet once more. As I prepared for a few hours of sleep, I had no idea that the strange spectacles lying on Holmes's table would soon lead us into one of the most unusual investigations of our career. The strangest part of the mystery was still ahead. And so, with the fire burning low and the rain fading beyond the windows, we settled down for what little sleep remained before our journey into Kent. The following morning brought a sharp change in the weather. The great storm had passed during the night, leaving London beneath a cold and pale winter sky. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, and a thin mist hung over the houses as Holmes and I made our way to Charing Cross. Stanley Hopkins was waiting for us. There was little conversation during the journey. Hopkins had already explained most of the facts of the case, and Holmes was not a man who liked to discuss an investigation before he had seen the place where the events had occurred. I noticed, however, that he remained thoughtful throughout the journey. The golden pince-nez lay safely in his pocket. From time to time, he would touch the pocket almost absent-mindedly, as though reminding himself of the clue which had brought him into the case. As our train moved away from London, the scenery gradually became quieter. The gray streets gave way to open country. The morning sun appeared weakly over the marshes, and the winter landscape stretched beneath a pale sky. The Thames lay in the distance, cold and somber. I remember the long journey with particular clarity because of the contrast between the peaceful countryside and the strange business waiting for us at its end. At length, we reached the small station from which we were to continue our journey by road. A horse and trap were waiting for us at a nearby inn. We took a hurried breakfast before setting out. Time we reached Yoxley Old Place. The morning was well advanced. A constable was waiting at the garden gate. The house stood in a quiet and secluded position. There was nothing about it to suggest violence or mystery. The garden appeared peaceful beneath the cold winter light, and the old building itself seemed to have withdrawn from the world around it. Yet within its walls, a young man had died. Hopkins immediately began reviewing what had happened since his first visit. No stranger had been reported at the railway station. Inquiries had been made at local inns and lodgings, but no unfamiliar visitor had been found. There was no obvious route by which an unknown person could have arrived and disappeared without leaving some trace. Holmes listened quietly. Then he turned his attention to the garden. The path from the gate to the house was the same one Hopkins had described to us in Baker Street. The recent rain had softened the ground, yet the path itself showed no clear footprints. Holmes bent down and examined the narrow strip of grass beside it. Here, as Hopkins had explained, there were faint signs that someone had passed. The grass was pressed down in places. It was not enough to reveal a footprint, but it was enough to show that someone had deliberately avoided the path. Holmes remained crouched over the grass for some time. The conclusion seemed simple. A person had entered the grounds while taking great care not to leave tracks, but Holmes was troubled by another question. If the woman had entered the house in this manner, how had she managed to leave? The same narrow strip of grass would have had to be used on the return journey. For a person with normal eyesight, this might have been possible, but the golden pince-nez had suggested that the woman who wore them was almost helpless without them. Holmes said little about this at the time. He simply looked once more at the grass and then turned toward the house. The garden door was normally left open. There had therefore been no difficulty for a stranger to enter. From the garden, the route led toward the back door, and then into the corridor beside the study. Holmes examined the arrangement carefully. The house had two passages leading away from the study. One gave access toward the garden. The other led toward Professor Coram's bedroom. There was no other convenient escape from the study. This arrangement immediately interested Holmes. He stood for several moments in the corridor, studying the floor. The passage was covered with coconut matting. No useful footprints could be found. The absence of marks was not surprising, but Holmes seemed to store the information away for later consideration. We then entered the study. It was a rather plain room. The most important object was the large writing table with its fixed bureau. The drawers stood open, as they apparently always did. Between them was a smaller cupboard which was locked. The cupboard contained Professor Coram's important papers. Nothing appeared to have been taken. At first glance, there seemed to be little more to discover, but Holmes had never depended upon first appearances. He approached the bureau and examined its surface closely. Then his attention settled upon a small mark near the keyhole. It was a scratch. The mark began upon the brass fitting beside the keyhole and extended several inches across the polished surface. Hopkins had noticed it during his earlier investigation, but had not regarded it as particularly important. Holmes immediately thought otherwise. He drew out his lens. The scratch was fresh. The exposed brass was bright, unlike the surrounding metal, and tiny fragments of varnish remained beside the mark. The damage had been made recently. Holmes asked whether the housekeeper had cleaned the bureau before the murder. She had. If she had dusted the surface after the scratch had been made, the loose pieces of varnish should have been removed. Since they remained, Holmes concluded that the scratch had appeared after the bureau had been cleaned. The timing fitted perfectly with the murder. He then asked, who possessed the key? The answer was important. Professor Coram kept it on his watch chain. It was not an ordinary key, but a Chubb's key. Holmes considered the matter quietly. The unknown woman had not come to the house merely to wander through the rooms. She had gone directly to the bureau. She had wanted something inside. The open drawers were of no value. If she had been looking for money or ordinary valuables, there would have been no reason to concern herself with the locked cupboard. Holmes therefore suspected that the cupboard contained the true object of her visit. But how had she entered it? The fresh scratch suggested that she had attempted to use a key. She apparently possessed one of her own. At this point, Holmes reconstructed the first part of the crime. The woman had entered the house carefully. She had walked through the garden without leaving an obvious footprint. She had reached the study. There she had gone directly to the bureau and attempted to open the locked cupboard. Then Willoughby Smith had entered. The young secretary had encountered the woman unexpectedly. A struggle had followed. The woman had not arrived carrying a weapon. That fact mattered greatly. The murder weapon had been a small sealing wax knife taken from the writing table. Holmes therefore believed that the fatal wound had not been deliberate. The woman, frightened and desperate, had seized the nearest object and struck at the young man simply to make him release her. The blow had been tragically accurate. Willoughby Smith had fallen. The woman had fled. But where? Holmes studied the two passages once more. Susan Tarleton had been coming down the stairs when she heard the cry. She would have seen anyone attempting to escape through the passage leading toward the garden. The other passage led directly toward Professor Coram's bedroom and appeared to have no exit. That left only one obvious possibility. The woman must have returned the way she had come, and yet Holmes did not seem satisfied. He asked to be shown the second corridor. We followed it. It was almost identical to the first. The same sort of matting covered the floor. The same narrow passage led toward the bedroom. Holmes paused. I remember the expression on his face. He had noticed something that I did not yet understand. The two corridors looked remarkably similar. For the moment, however, he said nothing. We continued to Professor Coram's room. The door was opened, and we entered. I had never forgotten my first sight of the old man. Professor Coram lay propped among the pillows of a large bed. He was a striking and somewhat disturbing figure. His face was gaunt and sharply shaped. His dark eyes were set deeply beneath heavy brows, while his hair and beard were white. There was a yellow stain around his mouth, caused by years of smoking. His fingers were stained in the same way. The room itself was crowded with books. Volumes filled the shelves and overflowed into piles upon the floor. Papers were stacked beside the bed and around the furniture. The air was heavy with tobacco smoke. Professor Coram greeted Holmes politely. His manner was cultivated, but there was something unusual beneath it. He spoke of his work and of the terrible loss of his young secretary. His great scholarly project, he explained, depended heavily upon the assistance of Willoughby Smith. Without the young man, his work had been interrupted. Holmes listened while walking slowly around the room. He seemed less interested in the professor's words than in the objects surrounding him. There were books everywhere. There were papers, furniture, cigarettes, and countless small details that an ordinary visitor would scarcely notice. Holmes noticed them all. Professor Coram spoke of the dead young man with apparent sadness, yet he could offer no useful explanation for the crime. He suggested that the final words spoken by Willoughby might have been confused by delirium. He also proposed another possibility. Perhaps the young secretary had taken his own life. Young men, he suggested, sometimes concealed emotional troubles from their employers. Holmes did not immediately challenge the theory. Instead, he asked about the golden pince-nez. The professor claimed that he could explain nothing about them. He suggested that they might have belonged to a woman connected with the young man's private life. Holmes remained calm. He then asked about the locked cupboard. Professor Coram explained that it contained family papers, old letters, and university diplomas. He produced the key and allowed Holmes to examine it. Holmes looked at it briefly. Then he returned it. He did not open the cupboard. This puzzled me. We had come to the house because of the locked bureau, and yet Holmes seemed satisfied merely to examine the key. He then suggested that we leave the professor undisturbed for a while. We returned to the garden. For some time, Holmes and I walked quietly along the path. I could see that he was thinking deeply. At last, I asked whether he had formed any theory. His answer surprised me. He said that everything might depend upon a cigarette he had smoked in Professor Coram's room. I could not imagine what connection tobacco could possibly have with a murder. Holmes did not explain. Instead, he turned his attention toward the housekeeper, Mrs. Marker, who was nearby. Within a few minutes, Holmes had gained her confidence. He asked casual questions about the professor's habits, particularly his smoking. The answers appeared ordinary at first. Professor Coram smoked constantly. His room could become so full of smoke that it resembled a London fog. Willoughby Smith had also smoked, although less heavily. Holmes then asked about the professor's appetite. This seemed like an insignificant question. Mrs. Marker, however, gave him an answer that caused him to pause. Professor Coram had eaten an unusually large breakfast that morning. He had also ordered a substantial lunch. Holmes had expected the opposite. After the death of his secretary, and after the number of cigarettes he had apparently consumed, the professor should have had little appetite. Yet he had eaten well. That detail quietly joined the other pieces in Holmes' mind. The morning passed slowly. Stanley Hopkins went into the nearby village to investigate reports that several children had seen the strange woman on the Chatham Road. Holmes remained in the garden with me. He seemed unusually quiet. I had rarely seen him handle a case with such apparent lack of energy. But I knew him well enough to understand that outward inactivity did not always mean that his mind was idle. He was waiting. Eventually, Hopkins returned. The children had indeed seen a woman. Their description corresponded closely with the one Holmes had derived from the golden pince-nez. She appeared to have been wearing spectacles or eyeglasses. This seemed to strengthen the theory that she was the unknown visitor. Yet Holmes showed little excitement. And another small fact came to us. Susan Tarleton, while attending to us at lunch, mentioned that she believed Willoughby Smith had gone for a walk on the previous morning. He had returned only about half an hour before the tragedy. To me, this seemed like a minor detail. To Holmes, it was different. I watched his expression change. The quiet uncertainty that had marked his face throughout the morning suddenly disappeared. He looked at his watch. It was almost 2 o'clock. The time had come to return to Professor Coram. We went upstairs once more. The old man had finished his lunch and was now dressed. He sat beside the fire in his bedroom, smoking as before. The large tin of cigarettes stood on the table near him. As we entered, Professor Coram pushed the tin toward Holmes. Holmes reached for it at almost the same moment. The box tipped over. Cigarettes scattered across the floor. For a minute or two, we were all occupied with collecting them. When Holmes rose, I saw something that I had not seen since the beginning of the investigation. His eyes were bright. There was color in his face. The familiar signs of intense concentration had returned. Holmes had reached a conclusion. The mystery of Yoxley Old Place was beginning to open before him. But even then, he had not yet told us the whole of his reasoning. He only stated calmly that he had solved the case. The professor stared at him. Stanley Hopkins and I were equally astonished. Holmes now intended to reconstruct the events of the previous day, piece by piece. And as he began, I realized that the golden pince-nez had been telling us far more than we had understood. Little did I know that the most important clue was not what the woman had done in the garden, but what she had been forced to do after losing her glasses. Professor Coram sat beside the fire, watching Holmes with an expression that was difficult to read. The room was quiet, except for the faint crackle of the logs and the soft sound of the professor's cigarette. Holmes stood near the table, apparently calm again. Yet I knew him well enough to recognize that his mind was moving rapidly. Stanley Hopkins and I waited for him to speak. At last, Holmes began to reconstruct the events of the previous day. He believed that a woman had entered the house with a definite purpose. She had not come to murder Willoughby Smith. She had come to obtain certain documents from the locked cupboard in the study. The scratch beside the keyhole supported this conclusion. The woman had possessed a key of her own, and Holmes had examined Professor Coram's key closely enough to establish that the scratch had not been made by it. Someone else had therefore attempted to open the cupboard. The woman had entered the study while it was empty. She had gone directly to the bureau and begun her work. Then Willoughby Smith had returned. At that moment, everything had changed. The young secretary had encountered the woman unexpectedly. He had seized her. She had panicked. There was no reason to believe that she had carried a weapon with her. Had she planned murder, she would surely have arrived prepared for it. Instead, she had reached desperately for the nearest object. That object had been the small sealing wax knife. The blow had been intended only to free herself, but the knife had struck the young man in the neck. The injury had been fatal. Holmes believed that the woman had been horrified by what she had done. She had not stopped to consider the consequences. She had simply fled, and this was where the mystery became more complicated. During the struggle, a woman had lost her golden pince-nez. Without those glasses, she would have been almost helpless. Holmes had already established that her eyesight was extremely poor. The strength of the lenses showed that she depended heavily upon them. Yet Hopkins had discovered something that seemed to contradict this. The woman had apparently walked carefully along the narrow strip of grass beside the garden path. If she had escaped in the same manner in which she had entered, she would have needed to retrace her steps without seeing clearly. Holmes considered this nearly impossible. There was another possibility. Perhaps she had not escaped through the garden at all. Perhaps she was still inside the house. The thought was so simple that I was almost embarrassed that I had not considered it myself. Holmes had noticed another important feature. The corridor leading from the study toward the garden and the corridor leading toward Professor Coram's bedroom were remarkably similar. Both were narrow. Both were covered with the same coconut matting. In the confusion following the murder, a nearly blind woman could easily have mistaken one for the other. If she had lost her glasses and fled blindly through the wrong passage, she might have believed she was returning toward the garden. Instead, she would have been moving directly toward Professor Coram's bedroom. The passage offered no escape. She could not go back. She could not remain in the corridor. She had only one choice. She had to continue forward. The passage led to a short flight of steps and a door. Beyond that door was Professor Coram's room. Holmes had therefore begun to suspect that the woman had entered the professor's bedroom immediately after the murder. But there was a further question. Where could she have hidden? Professor Coram's room was large, but it was crowded with books and furniture. There were many objects, yet no obvious place where a person could remain concealed for hours. Holmes had examined the room carefully. He considered the possibility of a trapdoor, but the carpet appeared firmly fixed to the floor. There were no signs of any opening beneath it. Then his attention turned to the books. Old houses often contained secret recesses behind bookcases. Such devices were not uncommon in older libraries and studies. Holmes examined the arrangement of the room. Books were piled upon the floor in many places, yet one bookcase stood differently. The space before it was unusually clear. It was a small detail, but Holmes had learned that an empty space could sometimes be more revealing than a crowded one. He suspected that the bookcase might conceal a door. There was no obvious handle. No visible mark showed where the mechanism might be. Still, Holmes had a suspicion. He needed evidence. That was why he had smoked so many of Professor Corum's cigarettes. I had wondered at the time why my friend had consumed cigarette after cigarette, while apparently doing nothing useful. In reality, he had been conducting an experiment. Holmes had dropped cigarette ash across the floor in front of the suspected bookcase. The ash would serve as a simple record. If anyone came out from behind the bookcase while we were away, the disturbance of the ash would reveal it. But Holmes required one more piece of evidence. He had already learned that Professor Coram had eaten a remarkably large breakfast. The professor was supposed to be an invalid with little appetite. Yet on the morning after the murder, he had eaten unusually well. He had also ordered a substantial lunch. Holmes suspected that the professor was not eating alone. If a hidden person was being sheltered inside his room, the extra food would have to come from somewhere. The housekeeper's observation, therefore, became important. The professor had been supplying food to another person. Holmes now had a theory, but he still needed to test it. That was why, when the cigarette box was knocked over, he had paid close attention to the floor. The scattered cigarettes gave him an unexpected advantage. The ash he placed before the bookcase was no longer undisturbed. There were traces across it. Someone had passed through the space. The hidden room was occupied. Holmes had now established that the woman was still inside the house. The professor's expression changed as he listened. He had remained remarkably composed while Holmes reconstructed the crime. But as the explanation approached the truth, I saw a growing tension in his face. Holmes continued. The woman had entered the professor's room after losing her spectacles. She had found herself trapped. The professor had known who she was. More importantly, he had chosen to protect her. Holmes now knew that the old man had not merely been an innocent observer. He'd been involved, yet there was still something missing. Holmes did not know exactly why Professor Coram would risk concealing a stranger accused of murder. Nor did he yet know what had brought the woman to Yoxley Old Place. The locked cupboard held the answer. The documents inside it were important enough for the woman to risk entering the house. They were important enough for her to fight for them. They were important enough for Professor Coram to fear their discovery. Holmes looked directly at the old man. He explained that the woman had come to steal certain documents from the bureau. She had possessed a key of her own. The professor had not been her accomplice at the beginning. She had entered without his knowledge, but after the accidental killing, circumstances had changed. Holmes believed that the woman had fled into the professor's room. There she had confronted the old man. She had told him who she was, and somehow, instead of handing her over to the police, Professor Coram had hidden her. He had concealed her behind the bookcase. He had then remained in his room while the police investigated the murder. This explained the otherwise strange facts surrounding the professor: his unusual appetite, his constant smoking, his apparent calm, his interest in keeping everyone away from the room. All these small details now seemed connected. Still, Professor Coram resisted. He insisted that he have remained in bed and could not possibly have known that a woman had entered his room. Holmes calmly rejected the objection. He never claimed that the professor had left his bed. He claimed something much more important. The professor had known the woman was there. He had spoken with her, and he had helped her escape detection. At this accusation, the old man's manner changed. His earlier politeness disappeared. His eyes became fierce. For a moment, the calm, scholarly invalid seemed to vanish, and in his place stood a man driven by fear. He denied Holmes's accusation. Holmes remained completely still. Then he turned toward the tall bookcase. He pointed to it. The professor followed his gesture. The room seemed suddenly very quiet. I remember the moment vividly. There was no dramatic movement at first, only the sound of the fire. Then the old man recoiled. His face changed. The bookcase moved. It swung slowly outward upon a hidden hinge. Behind it was a dark recess, and from that darkness came a woman. She stepped into the room. She was covered with dust and cobwebs. Her clothing had gathered dirt from the narrow hiding place, and her face was marked with grime. The sudden light appeared to trouble her. She blinked and looked around, trying to understand what had happened, but even in that exhausted condition, there was something dignified about her. Her chin was firm. Her head was held high. She had the virile physical characteristics Holmes had predicted from the golden pince-nez. Her eyesight was so poor that the change from darkness to light left her confused. Yet she did not appear broken. Stanley Hopkins moved toward her. She did not resist. Instead, she acknowledged that Holmes had discovered the truth. She had heard everything from her hiding place. She knew that her secret had been uncovered, and now she was ready to tell us what had really happened. The woman admitted that she had killed Willoughby Smith, but she insisted that the killing had been accidental. She had not known that the object she seized was a knife. She had only wanted to escape from the young man who had caught her. The fatal wound had been the terrible result of that struggle. Holmes accepted her statement. He could see that she was extremely unwell. Her face had become pale beneath the dust and exhaustion. She sat down on the side of Professor Corum's bed. Then she began to explain who she was. She told us that Professor Corum was her husband. The statement was astonishing. The old man had been living under another identity. He was not English. He was Russian. His true name was Sergius. The woman called herself Anna. She had married him many years earlier, when she was only 20 years old, and he was already 50. Their marriage had taken place in Russia. But their lives had been bound together by something far more complicated than affection. They had belonged to a revolutionary movement. They had been reformers and revolutionists. They had lived in dangerous times when political opposition could lead to imprisonment or death. Anna's voice remained controlled as she recalled those years. She told us that a police officer had been killed. Many members of their group had been arrested. The authorities needed evidence, and Professor Corum had betrayed them. To save himself and obtain a reward, he had given information against his own wife and companions. As a result, several members of the group were executed. Others were sent to Siberia. Anna was among those condemned to Siberian exile. Her husband escaped to England with the money he had gained through his betrayal. There he had lived quietly for years. But Anna had never forgotten what he had done, nor had she forgotten the people whose lives had been destroyed because of his evidence. There was one man in particular. His name was Alexis. He had been her closest friend among their comrades. He had been gentle, loyal, and opposed to violence. Anna believed that he was less guilty than the others. He had written letters arguing against their revolutionary activities. Those letters could have helped him. So could Anna's diary, in which she had recorded her thoughts and described the events of those difficult years. But Professor Coram had obtained both. He had hidden the letters and the diary. He had even attempted to use the material against Alexis. Although he had failed to have the man executed, Alexis had still been sentenced to Siberia. Years later, he remained there, working in a salt mine. Anna had never forgotten him. When her sentence ended, she devoted herself to finding the papers. She knew that if she could recover the diary and letters, they might be used to secure Alexis's release. Eventually, she discovered that her husband was living in England. She also learned that he still possessed the documents, but she knew he would never surrender them willingly. So, she decided to recover them herself. Her search had led her directly to Yoxley Old Place, and that was why the mysterious woman wearing the golden pince-nez had entered the house. The crime had begun as an attempt to recover the past. But the tragedy of Willoughby Smith had transformed everything. The woman had entered the study seeking justice for a man condemned long ago. Instead, she had found herself responsible for the death of an innocent young secretary. And now, hidden behind an old bookcase, her strength was beginning to fail. The truth of the mystery had finally emerged. But the story of Anna, Alexis, and Professor Coram was not yet finished, and the most painful part of her confession was still to come. Professor Coram stared at Holmes from his chair beside the fire. The room had become very still. A short time earlier, Holmes had announced that he had solved the mystery. I had watched the change come over his face when the cigarettes had fallen to the floor. Until that moment, I had not understood what he had discovered. Now, he began to explain. The woman who had killed Willoughby Smith had entered the house in search of something. She had not come there intending to murder him. Holmes was certain of that. The scratch upon the bureau showed that someone had attempted to open the locked cupboard. The golden pince-nez proved that the visitor was a woman with extremely poor eyesight. The footsteps in the grass showed that she had entered secretly, but the most important question remained unanswered. How had she escaped? The answer was that she had not escaped at all. Holmes explained that the woman had lost her glasses during the struggle with Willoughby Smith. Without them, she would have been almost helpless. She had rushed from the study in panic, believing that she was returning toward the garden, but the two passages in the house were almost identical. Both were covered with coconut matting. In her confusion, she had chosen the wrong one. Instead of reaching the garden, she had moved deeper into the house. She had climbed a short flight of stairs, opened a door, and found herself inside Professor Coram's bedroom. At that point, her escape had been cut off. She could not see properly. She could not safely return through the house, and the police were already beginning their search. So she had remained there. Professor Coram had known that she was present. Holmes now turned his attention to the old man. The professor had claimed that he had remained in his room throughout the day. Holmes accepted that statement. It was true. The professor had not needed to leave his room. The woman had come to him, and there was a hiding place in the room which only he knew about. Holmes had already suspected it. The large bookcases were packed with volumes, papers, and old manuscripts, yet behind one portion of the books was a concealed space, an old hiding place dating from the professor's earlier life. It was dark, narrow, and almost impossible to notice unless one already knew that it existed. The woman had been hidden there. Holmes had proved this through the cigarette ash. He had noticed that the professor smoked constantly. During their visit, he had deliberately smoked several cigarettes himself, dropping the ash around the room. Then, when the large tin of cigarettes had been knocked over, Holmes had taken the opportunity to look closely at the floor. There were disturbances in the ash. Someone had moved through the space. The hiding place was not empty. Holmes's chain of reasoning was now complete. The mysterious woman had entered the study. She had opened the cupboard. Willoughby Smith had discovered her. There had been a struggle. The young man had been killed. The woman had lost her spectacles. She had fled blindly through the wrong corridor. She had reached Professor Corum's room, and the professor had hidden her. The old man could no longer deny it. Holmes had reconstructed the entire sequence without ever seeing the woman. The final evidence had been lying in the ash. The bookcase stood quietly against the wall. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then there was a faint movement. One section of the bookcase shifted. A narrow opening appeared. From the darkness behind it emerged a woman. I shall never forget the sight. She was covered with dust. Her clothing was marked with dirt, and strands of cobweb clung to her hair and shoulders. Her face was pale and exhausted, yet there was something dignified in her appearance. She stood upright, despite her weakness. Her eyesight was so poor that she blinked repeatedly when she came into the light. Stanley Hopkins moved toward her. She did not resist. She had heard Holmes' entire explanation from her hiding place. There was no longer any reason to conceal the truth. She knew that the investigation was finished. The woman admitted that she had killed Willoughby Smith, but she insisted that it had been an accident. She had not even known that the object she seized from the writing table was a knife. When the young man caught her, she had been desperate to escape. She had grabbed at the nearest object and struck out. The blow had caused the tiny but fatal wound in his neck. She had not understood what she had done until she saw him fall. Then she had fled in terror. Holmes accepted her explanation. Everything he had seen supported it. The position of the wound, the weapon, the absence of preparation, and the circumstances of the struggle all pointed in the same direction. This had not been a planned murder. It had been a terrible accident. The woman sat down upon the side of Professor Corum's bed. Her face was becoming paler. Holmes immediately noticed that she was seriously unwell. She said that she had only a short time left and wished to tell the whole truth. Then came the revelation that changed the meaning of the entire case. She was Professor Corum's wife. The old man had been living under an assumed identity. He was Russian. The woman was Anna. Professor Corum's expression changed when she spoke her name. For the first time since our arrival, the old man's composure disappeared. He looked at her with an expression in which fear, affection, and shame seemed strangely mixed. Anna ignored him. Her story belonged to a distant world. Many years earlier, she had married him when she was only 20 years old. He had been 50. They had lived in Russia during a period of political unrest. Both had belonged to a revolutionary movement. They were reformers and nihilists, along with a number of other young people who believed that the Russian government needed radical change. Their lives had been dangerous. They lived with the constant knowledge that the authorities were watching them. Then came a terrible crisis. A police officer was killed. Many members of the group were arrested. The authorities needed evidence. Professor Corum betrayed his companions. He gave information to the authorities in order to save his own life. He also received a substantial reward. His evidence led to the arrest and punishment of the people who had trusted him. Anna was among those who suffered. She was sent to Siberia. Other members of the group were also condemned. Among them was a man named Alexis. Anna spoke of him with particular feeling. He had been her friend, and she believed him to be innocent of the serious charges brought against him. He had not been a violent man. His writings showed that he had opposed some of the more dangerous actions of the revolutionary group. Yet because of the evidence surrounding the case, He had been punished. He remained in Siberia. Anna had never forgotten him. During her years of exile, she continued to think about the documents that might prove his innocence. There was a diary. There were letters. Together they could establish the truth. If those papers were sent to the Russian authorities, they might help secure Alexis's release. But Professor Coram had taken the documents with him when he escaped to England. Anna knew that he still possessed them. She also knew that he would never willingly give them back. Years passed. Eventually, her own sentence ended. She began searching for her husband. It was a long and difficult search. At last, she discovered that Professor Coram was living in England. She learned where he had established himself, but she could not simply walk into the house and demand the papers. She needed to know where they were kept, so she engaged the private detective. The detective's agent entered Professor Coram's household as a secretary. He was able to learn the arrangement of the house. He discovered that the important papers were kept in the locked cupboard in the study. He also obtained an impression of the key. He went no further. Instead, he provided Anna with the information she needed. She learned that the study was usually empty during the late morning because Willoughby Smith, the professor's secretary, was normally upstairs. Anna decided that this was her opportunity. She traveled to Yoxley Old Place. Before entering the house, she had encountered Willoughby Smith on the road. She had asked him for directions to Professor Coram's residence. She did not know that he was the professor's secretary. The young man later returned to the house. He told Professor Coram about the strange woman he had met. That detail explained Willoughby's final words. As he lay dying, he had tried to tell Susan that the woman was responsible. He had said, in effect, that it was she. Holmes now understood why the dying man had tried to raise his hand. He had been attempting to make the connection clear. Anna had then entered the study. She had opened the cupboard using the key that had been copied for her. She had found the papers. She had taken them. Then Willoughby entered. He recognized her as the woman he had met earlier. He seized her. She struggled desperately. In the confusion, she grabbed the small knife from the writing table. The fatal blow followed. Anna fled. She lost her golden pince-nez, and without them, she made the mistake that had allowed Holmes to solve the case. She entered the wrong passage. When she reached Professor Coram's room, he recognized her. At first, he threatened to give her up, but Anna reminded him of their past. If he handed her to the authorities, she could reveal his betrayal to the Brotherhood. His own past would be exposed. His safety depended upon hers. For that reason, he hid her. He placed her inside the concealed room behind the bookcase. He then supplied her with food from his own meals. That explained his unusually large appetite. The professor had been feeding 2 people. It also explained why Holmes had noticed so much smoking. The old man had remained in his room, guarding the secret while the police searched the house. The plan had been simple. Once the police departed, Anna would leave the house at night. She would never return. But Holmes had discovered the hiding place before she could escape. The woman reached into her clothing. She removed a small packet. Her hands trembled. Inside were the documents she had risked everything to obtain. She placed them before Holmes. These papers, she explained, could save Alexis. She trusted Holmes to deliver them to the Russian embassy. She had judged him by his reputation. She believed that a man who had spent his life pursuing truth would not allow the documents to disappear. Holmes accepted the packet. Anna then seemed to gather what little strength remained to her. She had accomplished the purpose for which she had come to Yoxley Old Place. The papers were safe. Alexis might yet be saved. But there was one final thing she had kept hidden. Holmes noticed the sudden movement of her hand. He saw the small file Anna had brought poison with her. Before she could raise it fully, Holmes sprang across the room. He seized her hand, but he was too late. She had already swallowed the poison. For a moment, Holmes struggled to save her. He called for water and medical assistance, but Anna knew that her end was near. She had expected this moment. Her face became calm. There was no longer fear in her expression, only exhaustion. She had lived for years with one purpose. She had found the papers. She had entrusted them to Holmes. Now she had nothing more to accomplish. The room fell silent. Professor Coram remained seated beside the fire, staring at the woman who had once been his young wife. The old man's face became strangely empty. He seemed to have aged many years in a few minutes. Holmes stood beside Anna, watching helplessly as her strength faded. The case that had begun with a golden pair of spectacles had ended with a story of betrayal, exile, loyalty, and sacrifice. There was no triumph in it. The death of Willoughby Smith remained a tragedy. Anna's own death was another. And Professor Coram, despite having survived, seemed almost like a man already condemned by the weight of his past. Anna's final request remained clear. The papers must reach the Russian embassy. Holmes would see that they did. As we prepared to leave Yoxley Old Place, I looked once more at the golden pince-nez. They had seemed at first to be merely a clue to the appearance of a murderer. In truth, they had revealed almost everything. They had told Holmes that their owner was severely short-sighted. That had explained her confusion. Her confusion had led her into the wrong corridor. The wrong corridor had taken her to Professor Coram, and the professor's secret had led Holmes to the hidden bookcase. Every small fact had joined the next. It was, as Holmes so often demonstrated, the quiet accumulation of details that revealed the truth. The rain had begun again by the time we left the house. The garden path was dark beneath the evening sky. The grass beside it still carried the faint marks of the mysterious visitor who had entered Yoxley Old Place. But there was nothing mysterious about those marks now. They were simply the final traces of a woman who had crossed the grounds in search of justice and who had left behind a story that I have never forgotten. Little did I know, as we traveled back toward London, how deeply the strange fate of Anna would remain in my memory. For some moments after the woman had emerged from behind the bookcase, I could do little more than stare at her. The strange apparition that had haunted our investigation had suddenly become a human being before us. She was an elderly woman, though it was difficult to judge her exact age. Her face was thin and worn, and her clothing showed the marks of the narrow hiding place in which she had spent so many hours. The golden pince-nez was gone. Without them, she looked almost helpless. Yet there was a firmness in her expression. It immediately impressed me. She had been discovered. There was no longer any hope of escape. Still, she seemed relieved that the truth had finally come into the open. Holmes watched her carefully. He had no need to ask whether she was the woman he had described from the spectacles. Her appearance confirmed every detail of his deduction: the broad nose, the close-set eyes, the peculiar expression produced by extreme short-sightedness, the rounded shoulders. Everything matched. I found myself thinking of our first examination of the pince-nez in Baker Street. At that time, the spectacles had seemed like a cold and lifeless object. Now, they seemed almost like a portrait. They had told Holmes about a woman before we had ever seen her face. The woman looked toward Professor Coram. There was a long silence between them. It was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who had once known each other very closely and had since traveled far apart. Holmes asked her name. She answered simply, Anna. The old professor shifted in his chair. His face had become pale. Holmes then asked whether she was Professor Corum's wife. She confirmed it. The revelation explained the strange expression that had crossed the professor's face when Holmes first suggested that the woman was hiding somewhere inside the house. He had known her. He had recognized her, and he had concealed her. But why? That was the question which remained. Anna began to tell us. Her voice was weak, but she spoke with determination. Many years earlier, she had married Professor Corum in Russia. At that time, he had been known by another name. They had been connected with a revolutionary movement. Their lives had been dangerous, and their political beliefs had placed them in opposition to the Russian authorities. Was a world far removed from the quiet English house in which we now stood. The old professor, surrounded by books and cigarettes, seemed an unlikely figure to have lived such a life. Yet Anna's account made it clear that his past had been far darker than his present appearance suggested. There had been a group of revolutionaries. Among them was a man named Eccles. Anna spoke of him with particular tenderness. He had been a close friend. She believed him to be innocent of the worst charges brought against the group. He had not supported the more violent actions of the movement. His writings and letters showed that he had tried to restrain the others. Yet when the authorities began their investigation, Professor Corum betrayed his companions. He gave information that helped the police. His betrayal saved himself. The others paid the price. Some were executed. Others were transported to Siberia. Anna herself was sent there. Eccles was also imprisoned. For years, Anna endured the harsh conditions of exile. But the passage of time did not erase her memories. She remembered the people who had been lost. Most of all, she remembered Eccles. She believed that documents existed which could prove that he had not been responsible for the crimes attributed to him. Those documents were letters and a diary. If they could be delivered to the Russian authorities, they might provide the evidence needed to secure his release. But the papers were in Professor Corum's possession. He had taken them with him when he escaped to England. Anna knew that he had them because, during her imprisonment, she had received a letter from him. In that letter, he had quoted passages from her diary. He had mocked her with knowledge that he could only have obtained by reading it. That detail had never left her mind. She knew the papers still existed, and she knew that her husband would never willingly give them back. When their term of imprisonment ended, she began the search for him. It took months. Eventually, she discovered that he was living in England. He had changed his identity. He had become Professor Corum. He had established himself at Yoxley Old Place and lived there as an elderly scholar. To the outside world, he was simply a learned invalid working upon a great academic project. To Anna, he was the man who had betrayed her. She needed the papers. She therefore engaged a private detective. The detective found a way into the professor's household. One of the professor's former secretaries had been working for the detective. The man discovered where the important documents were kept. They were in the locked cupboard in the study. He also obtained an impression of the key. A duplicate was made. The detective supplied Anna with a plan of the house. He also learned something else. During the morning, the study was generally empty. Willoughby Smith, the professor's secretary, was usually occupied elsewhere. Anna therefore believed that she could enter the house, open the cupboard, take the papers, and leave before anyone noticed her. It was a carefully planned attempt. She had no intention of harming anyone. She had not gone there as an assassin. She had gone there as a woman trying to recover evidence which she believed might save the life of an innocent friend. On the morning of the tragedy, she traveled to the area around Yoxley Old Place. Before reaching the house, she encountered a young man. She needed directions. She asked him where Professor Coram lived. A young man was Willoughby Smith. Anna did not know this. She had no reason to suspect that the stranger she had approached was connected with the professor. Smith gave her directions. Then he continued on his way. Later, when he returned to Yoxley Old Place, he mentioned the encounter to Professor Coram. This explained the dying man's final words. He had tried to tell those around him that the woman who had attacked him was the same woman who had been asking about the professor. He had not been able to complete his explanation, but Holmes had understood the significance. The young man's final words had been one more piece of the puzzle. Anna continued her story. She entered the house. She reached the study. She used the duplicate key. She opened the cupboard. Inside were the papers she had spent years seeking. She took them. For a brief moment, she believed that her mission had succeeded. Then Willoughby Smith entered. He saw her. He recognized her as the woman who had asked him for directions. He seized her. She struggled. Everything happened in a few seconds. She had no weapon. She had not expected to be confronted. In desperation, she reached toward the writing table and seized the nearest object. It was the sealing wax knife. She struck out. The blow was fatal. She had not even realized what she had done. When Willoughby fell, she was horrified. She fled from the room. In the struggle, the golden pince-nez had been torn from her face. She was now almost blind. She ran through the corridor. She believed that she was going toward the garden, but the two passages were so similar that she chose the wrong one. Only when she had gone too far did she understand her mistake. She could not return. She could not see clearly enough to find another route. And somewhere in the house, the police were already beginning to search. She pushed open a door. She found herself in Professor Coram's bedroom. The professor was there. He recognized her immediately. At first, Anna said he considered giving her to the authorities, but she reminded him of their past. If he betrayed her again, she could reveal his identity. The Brotherhood had never forgotten his betrayal. If the truth became known, his safety would disappear. Anna did not need to threaten him with violence. She simply made him understand that her fate and his were now connected. If she was arrested, his past would be revealed. The professor, therefore, agreed to hide her. He knew of a secret hiding place. It was an old relic from his earlier life. He pushed Anna into the dark recess behind the bookcase. There she remained while the police investigated the murder. The arrangement explained several things that had puzzled Holmes. The professor ate all his meals in his own room. His appetite had suddenly become much larger. That was because he was secretly sharing his food with Anna. He had also remained unusually protective of his room. He knew that discovery would mean disaster for both of them. The plan had been to wait until the police left. Anna would then slip out of the house during the night. She would never return, but Holmes discovered the plan. The old professor sat motionless while she spoke. There was no need for him to deny anything. The evidence was complete. Anna then explained why she had taken such risks. She did not care greatly about her own future. Her purpose was Alexis. The letters and diary could establish his innocence. She believed that if the papers reached the Russian authorities, they might secure his release from Siberia. That was why she had come to England. That was why she had come to England. That was why she had come to England. That was why she had risked everything. The packet was still with her. She reached inside her dress and brought it out. Holmes watched silently. The packet was small. It contained the papers that had driven this entire chain of events. Anna placed them in Holmes's hands. She trusted him. She knew that he was a man devoted to truth. She asked him to deliver the papers to the Russian embassy. It was the final duty she wished to complete. The room had become painfully quiet. I could see that Anna was exhausted. She had spent hours concealed behind the bookcase. She had endured the shock of the murder. She had been forced to reveal her entire past, and now the purpose for which she had come was complete. She had found the documents. They were safe. Holmes had them. For a moment, I thought the case was finished. Then as Anna moved toward her dress, Holmes noticed the movement immediately. He saw a small phial. He sprang forward, but Anna had already taken the poison. Holmes seized the bottle from her hand. It was too late. She had swallowed the poison before leaving the hiding place. She sank back upon the bed. Her head had begun to swim. Her final thoughts were still fixed upon Alexis. She reminded Holmes of the packet. He promised to remember. Then her strength failed. The room became silent. I stood beside Holmes, unable to think of anything to say. The tragedy had ended almost as quietly as it had begun. There had been no great struggle, no dramatic confession. Only a tired woman, a packet of old papers, and the final consequences of events that had begun many years earlier in another country. Holmes looked down at the packet. He understood that the mystery had been solved, but that solving it had brought no sense of victory. Willoughby Smith was dead. Anna was dead. Professor Coram remained alive, but his past had been exposed. Stanmos went far away. Alexis still waited in Siberia. The entire case had grown from the smallest of clues, a golden pince-nez, a few disturbed blades of grass, a scratch beside a keyhole, a large appetite, cigarette ash on a floor, a bookcase that stood slightly apart from the rest. Each clue seemed insignificant by itself. Together they had revealed the truth. Holmes placed the packet carefully inside his coat. He intended to carry out Anna's final request. As we prepared to leave Yoxley Old Place, I looked once more around the professor's room. The fire was still burning. The books stood in their shelves. The old house seemed peaceful again. Yet I knew that it would never appear peaceful to me in quite the same way. There are houses in which events leave an impression upon the mind. Yoxley Old Place was one of them. The walls had witnessed betrayal. They had concealed a fugitive. They had sheltered the evidence of an old injustice. And they had seen the death of two people whose lives had been joined to Wisteria by a painful history. Holmes and I eventually left the room. Stanley Hopkins had his own report to make. The police would need to be informed of everything that had happened. Holmes, as usual, had little interest in receiving praise. He had solved a mystery. That was enough. As we traveled back toward London, he sat quietly beside me. The countryside passed outside the carriage window. The afternoon light was fading. Neither of us spoke for some time. At last, Holmes broke the silence. The case, he said, had been simple in one respect. It had hinged upon the pince-nez from the beginning. Without the spectacles, the solution would have been far more difficult. I understood what he meant. The glasses had revealed the woman's poor eyesight. Her poor eyesight had made her escape across the grass almost impossible. That suggested that she had remained inside the house. The similarity between the two corridors then provided the next step. She could easily have taken the wrong passage. Once inside Professor Coram's room, she needed somewhere to hide. Holmes had searched for such a place. He had noticed the unusual arrangement of the furniture. Then he had used the cigarette ash to test his theory. It was a perfect example of his method. He had not guessed the answer. He had built it. One fact had led to another and another, until there was nowhere else for the truth to hide. I watched the dark countryside outside. The events of the case had left me thoughtful. Holmes's brilliance had solved the mystery, but it had not changed the tragedy at its heart. A young man had died because he happened to enter a room at the wrong moment. A woman had died because she believed that one final act might save the man she loved. And an old man had been forced to confront the consequences of his own betrayal. The case was therefore not memorable merely because of the golden spectacles. It remained with me because behind the mystery was a human story. The evidence had been cold. The consequences had not been. Little did I know then how often, in the years that followed, I would remember that quiet journey back from Locksley Old Place. The room remained silent after Anna had finished speaking. For a few moments, I could hear nothing but the faint ticking of the clock and the soft crackle of the fire. The story she had told us seemed almost too large to belong within that quiet bedroom. Years of suffering had led her to this house. Years of waiting had brought her to the locked cupboard. And now, after all that time, the papers she had sought were finally within her reach. Holmes stood near the bed, watching her carefully. Professor Coram remained in his chair. He seemed strangely calm. Perhaps there was little left for him to fear. His secret had been uncovered. His wife had told the truth. And the documents he had guarded for so many years were now in Holmes' possession. Anna slowly drew a small packet from inside her clothing. Her fingers trembled as she held it. These were the letters and papers that had been at the center of her struggle. They were old documents, carefully folded and protected. To an ordinary observer, they might have seemed almost worthless. But Anna knew their value. They contained evidence that could change the fate of a man who had spent years in Siberia. She looked at Holmes. There was trust in her expression. She had never known him before this day, yet she had judged him by his reputation. She knew that he had devoted his life to uncovering the truth. She believed that he would not allow the documents to disappear. Holmes took the packet. He examined it only briefly. Then he placed it safely inside his coat. Anna seemed relieved. Her purpose was nearly complete. She had come to England to recover those papers. She had entered Locksley Old Place alone. She had risked discovery. She had lost her spectacles. She had killed Willoughby Smith without intending to do so. She had hidden behind the bookcase. And now, after all those dangers, the evidence was finally safe. But Holmes noticed something else. Anna's face had changed. The color had almost disappeared from it. Her breathing had become shallow. She placed one hand against her chest. I stepped forward. Holmes was already moving. Anna had concealed a small file. Holmes reached for it. He seized her hand and pulled the bottle away. But there was nothing he could do. She had already taken the poison. The bottle was empty. Holmes examined her face. His expression became grave. She had expected this. She had deliberately kept poison with her. Perhaps she had known that her life would end when the final part of her mission was complete. Anna looked toward Holmes. She was not frightened. Instead, she seemed almost peaceful. She reminded him of the packet. The documents must reach the Russian embassy. Holmes assured her that he would deliver them himself. She appeared satisfied. Then her eyes moved toward Professor Coram. For the first time, I saw something like sorrow in her expression. It was not the sorrow of a woman who regretted her own actions. It was the sorrow of remembering what their marriage had once been. They had been young ones. They had shared beliefs. They had belonged to the same movement. They had trusted each other. Then everything had changed. Professor Coram had chosen his own safety. Anna had paid the price. Their lives followed different paths. He had escaped to England. She had endured Siberia. He had become an English scholar. She had spent years searching for the evidence that could help Alexis, and now they were together again, only at the end of everything. Professor Coram looked at her. He did not attempt to speak. Perhaps there were words he wished to say. Perhaps there were apologies that could never be spoken. Anna closed her eyes. The room became very still. Holmes stood beside her. I had seen death many times during my medical career, yet there was something especially sad about this one. Anna had not died because she was defeated. In her own mind, she had completed her task. The papers were safe. The truth was known. The future of Alexis was no longer entirely hopeless. Her final duty had been accomplished. After a short interval, Anna's breathing ceased. Holmes lowered his head. For some time he said nothing. Then he carefully placed the packet inside his coat once more. The mystery was solved, but the atmosphere was not one of victory. There had been too much suffering. Willoughby Smith was dead. Anna was dead. Professor Coram remained alive, but his life had been exposed as a history of betrayal. And somewhere in Russia, Alexis still waited. Holmes finally turned toward Hopkins. The inspector had listened to the entire confession. His face showed the mixture of relief and discomfort that often comes when a difficult investigation reaches an unexpected conclusion. The case had begun. The baffling murder. There had seemed to be no motive. Willoughby Smith had possessed no known enemies. He had lived quietly as Professor Coram's secretary. There had been no obvious reason for anyone to kill him. Now the reason was clear. He had simply interrupted someone who had come searching for papers. It was a terrible example of how a peaceful life could be changed by a single moment. Holmes reviewed the evidence one final time. The golden pince-nez had belonged to the woman. Their thick lenses showed that she was extremely short-sighted. That fact had been important from the beginning. A woman with such poor eyesight cannot easily have escaped through the garden after losing her spectacles. The narrow strip of grass beside the path had provided another clue. There were no proper footprints. The woman had moved carefully along the grass. But once her glasses were lost, Holmes reasoned that she would have been unable to follow the same route safely. She would have been almost blind. That meant she was probably still inside the house. Holmes then considered the two corridors. Both were lined with coconut matting. That was precisely what had happened. Anna had taken wrong passage. She had entered Professor Coram's bedroom. The next clue had been the professor's unusual appetite. Holmes had casually asked the housekeeper about his meals. The answer had seemed insignificant. The professor had eaten much more than usual, but Holmes had understood its meaning. Someone else was being fed. The hidden woman had been receiving part of the professor's meals. There was another clue. Holmes had noticed that one section of the room was strangely free of the piles of books and papers found elsewhere. The old bookcase stood in front of a concealed space. Holmes suspected that it might be a hiding place. He therefore scattered cigarette ash around the room. The professor's cigarettes provided an excellent material for this purpose. Holmes smoked heavily during the morning. Then he waited. When the cigarette box was knocked over, later that afternoon, he had an excuse to examine the floor closely. The ash had been disturbed. Someone had moved near the bookcase. That was enough. Holmes knew that the woman was there. He had not needed to search every cupboard or tear apart every room. He had simply followed the evidence. I reflected upon this while we prepared to leave. There was something almost beautiful about the simplicity of Holmes's reasoning. The case had appeared complicated because facts were scattered. But Holmes had gathered them together. The spectacles, the grass, the corridors, the appetite, the cigarette ash, the bookcase. Each clue had been small. Together, they formed a complete picture. That was the quality I admired most in Holmes. He never allowed a clue to remain isolated. He asked what it implied. Then he asked what. Little by little, the entire structure emerged. As we descended the stairs, I looked back toward the study. It was difficult to believe that such a quiet room had been the scene of a violent. The writing table remained where it had always stood. The books were still arranged upon the shelves. The small sealing wax knife had been removed as evidence, yet the room itself seemed unchanged. That was one of the strange things about murder. The furniture remained. The clocks continued. The fire burned. The world outside carried on. Only the lives of the people involved had been permanently altered. Outside, the evening had become colder. A thin mist lay across the garden. The trees were bare. Their branches moved gently in the wind. A carriage waited near the gate. Holmes and I climbed inside. Hopkins had decided to return separately to report the result of the investigation. He was satisfied that the mystery had been explained. Holmes did not appear concerned about receiving credit. As usual, he seemed more interested in the intellectual problem than in public recognition. The carriage moved away from Yoxley Old Place. For a time, neither of us spoke. The wheels moved steadily over the damp road. Beyond windows, countryside passed beneath the darkness. I thought about Anna. There was much in her life that I could not approve of. She had entered a house secretly. She had taken documents that did not legally belong to her, and she had caused the death of Willoughby Smith. Yet it was impossible for me to regard her simply as a criminal. She had endured extraordinary suffering. She had believed that she was acting for justice, and she had not intended to kill the young man. Her tragedy lay partly in the fact that her noble purpose had led her into a terrible act. Holmes seemed to understand this distinction. He did not excuse the killing, but neither did he treat Anna as an ordinary murderer. He had seen the whole story. That was often the difference between Holmes and the people who judged a case from a distance. He wanted to know why something had happened, not merely what had happened. I asked Holmes whether he thought Alexis would really be released. He believed that the documents would provide strong evidence. The Russian embassy would receive them. From there, the papers would be examined. The authorities would decide what should follow. Holmes could not guarantee the outcome, but Anna had done everything she could, and Holmes would honor his promise. The road became busier as we approached London. Soon the quiet countryside gave way to familiar streets. Gas lamps appeared one after another. Their warm circles of light shone through the mist. Carriage wheels passed over the wet stones. London was returning to its ordinary evening rhythm. I found the contrast strangely comforting. After the dark history of Yoxley Old Place, the familiar streets of London seemed almost welcoming. Holmes leaned back in the carriage. He appeared tired. Cases that required long periods of concentration often exhausted him more than cases involving physical danger. The golden pince-nez had required patience. There had been no obvious motive, no clear suspect, no straightforward path from the victim to the murderer. The answer had been hidden in a series of small contradictions. The woman had poor eyesight, yet seemed to have escaped through the garden. The professor claimed to have no connection with her, yet his behavior suggested that someone else was being fed. The room appeared ordinary, yet the cigarette ash revealed movement. Holmes had simply refused to ignore those contradictions. That was his greatest strength. When a fact did not fit, he did not force it into the theory. He changed the theory. I had learned that lesson many times during our years together. As we reached Baker Street, weather had grown worse. Rain began to fall again. The familiar windows of 221B glowed warmly above the street. For a moment, I felt grateful for the simple comfort of our rooms, the fire, the books, the familiar chairs, the scent of tobacco. After the cold journey from Kent, Baker Street seemed almost like another world. Holmes removed his coat. He took the packet from his pocket and placed it carefully upon the table. These documents were now the final responsibility of the case. He would deliver them to the Russian embassy. The next morning, he intended to do so. I watched him for a moment. The investigation was over, but the story itself had left a deep impression upon me. I had often written that Holmes's cases were exercises in deduction. This one was different. The deduction had been extraordinary, but the human story behind it was even more memorable. A golden pair of spectacles had led us to a woman. That woman had led us to a secret. The secret had led us back 30 years into the past, and the past had finally reached into the quiet study of an old English house. It reminded me that no life exists entirely in the present. Old choices can remain hidden for years. A betrayal committed decades earlier may still affect people who were not even born when it occurred. A forgotten letter may become important. A diary may survive. A name may be remembered. Sometimes after many years, the past returns unexpectedly. That was what had happened at Yoxley Old Place. The murder had seemed to belong entirely to the present. In reality, its roots stretched back many years. The young secretary had been caught in a conflict that began long before he was born. The final tragedy had been caused by an old injustice. Holmes had understood this. He had followed the evidence backward until he reached the beginning. And in doing so, he had uncovered more than a murderer. He had uncovered a history. The fire burned quietly that night at Baker Street. The rain continued against the windows. For once, Holmes did not immediately begin another investigation. He sat in silence, looking toward the packet of papers. I knew that he was thinking of Anna. Perhaps he was also thinking of Alexis. Perhaps he wondered what would happen when the documents reached Russia. But Holmes was not a man given to speculation. When facts were still available, he would do what he had promised. The papers would go to the Russian embassy. After that, the matter would leave his hands. And so the strange case of the golden pince-nez had reached its final stage. The mystery was solved. The evidence was secured. The truth had been uncovered. But before we closed the case entirely, there remained one last journey to make. The following day, Holmes and I would carry Anna's final message through the streets of London. And I would see once more how quietly Sherlock Holmes could perform a duty that, to another man, might have seemed almost forgotten amid the excitement of solving a murder. The following morning was quiet at Baker Street. The rain had passed during the night, leaving the windows silvered with moisture. A pale light entered the sitting room, and the fire had settled into a gentle glow. I had slept poorly. The events at Yoxley Old Place had remained in my thoughts. The death of Willoughby Smith was tragic enough, but the story of Anna had given the case sadness which I found difficult to put aside. Holmes, on the other hand, appeared remarkably composed. He had spent much of the early morning reading through the documents Anna had entrusted to him. They were old papers. Some had faded with time. Others had been folded and unfolded so often that the edges had become soft. Holmes handled them with great care. He was not interested merely in what they contained. He wished to establish their authenticity. That was always his way. A document could be genuine and still be misunderstood. A letter could tell one story when read alone, and another when placed beside the events surrounding it. Holmes therefore read everything carefully. I sat near the fire and watched him. Outside, London was beginning another ordinary day. Carriages passed along Baker Street. A milkman called somewhere below. The distant sound of wheels came and went through the morning fog. It seemed strange that such an ordinary world could continue while the events of the previous day were still so fresh in our minds. Holmes eventually gathered the papers into a neat packet. He had found what Anna had described. There was indeed material concerning Alexis. The letter showed that the man had not been the dangerous revolutionary that Professor Corum's evidence had made him appear. His position had been more complicated. He had opposed some of the group's actions. His own words suggested that he had attempted to moderate the others, yet the authorities have regarded him as part of the conspiracy. The evidence against him had been strengthened by Professor Coram. Anna had spent years believing that those papers could change the judgment against him. Holmes believed she had been right. He placed the documents in an envelope. Then he sealed it. There was something almost ceremonial in the movement. Anna had trusted him with her final request. He intended to fulfill it exactly. I asked whether he thought the Russian authorities would act upon the evidence. Holmes answered cautiously. He could not predict what officials might do. But the papers were genuine, and they deserved to be considered. That was all that mattered to him. He had no wish to make promises that were beyond his control. We left Baker Street later that morning. The city was still wrapped in a thin mist. Gas lamps remained burning in some of the darker streets, although daylight was gradually strengthening. Holmes walked beside me with his usual quick, measured step. He carried the packet securely inside his coat. For a while we discussed nothing. Then as we crossed the street, Holmes began to consider the case again. He returned, not to the dramatic events, but to the small details. He spoke of the pince-nez. The glasses had been the first important clue. They had revealed that the unknown woman possessed extremely poor eyesight. That fact had seemed simple, but it had changed the entire investigation. Without the glasses, Anna could not have escaped easily. Holmes had therefore asked himself where she could have gone. The garden appeared the obvious route, but the evidence did not support it. The grass showed signs of a careful approach, but no convincing trail of a hurried departure. This had suggested that the woman was still inside the house. Then there was the scratch beside the keyhole. It proved that someone had tried to open the locked cupboard, and meant the visitor had entered the study for a particular purpose. She had not been wandering through the house. She had been searching for something. The documents explained that purpose. The problem had then become one of finding the woman. Holmes had noticed the similarity between the corridors. A person with normal eyesight might have chosen the correct passage without difficulty. Anna had been almost blind without her spectacles. She had taken the wrong route. That mistake had led her directly to Professor Coram. The professor's behavior had then supplied another set of clues. His extraordinary appetite, his constant smoking, his unwillingness to have anyone remain in his room, the hidden bookcase, the disturbed cigarette ash. Each detail had appeared insignificant. Together, they had formed a clear picture. Holmes explained that this was often the most difficult part of an investigation. A dramatic clue was easy to notice. A small contradiction was much easier to ignore. Yet contradictions were frequently more useful. If a man claimed to be alone, but consumed food intended for two, there was a question. If a room appeared empty but the dust had been disturbed, there was another. If a woman with poor eyesight appeared to have escaped across open ground, circumstances required further thought. Holmes never accepted a fact simply because it appeared convenient. He tested it. That habit had solved countless cases. As we continued through London, I thought about how differently the case might have appeared to another detective. The murder weapon had been found. The victim had died in the study. A woman had been seen near the house. It would have been easy to conclude that she had fled. The investigation might then have concentrated entirely upon finding her outside. But Holmes had questioned that assumption. He had asked whether a woman without her spectacles could really have escaped in the way everyone imagined. That single question had turned the investigation inward. The murderer was not somewhere on the roads around Yoxley Old Place. She was still inside the house. And once Holmes understood that, the rest became possible. We eventually completed our business in London. The documents were delivered into the proper hands. Holmes made certain that Anna's request was recorded. He did not make a public display of it. He did not seek recognition. He simply fulfilled his promise. On our return journey, the weather had improved. The clouds had lifted slightly. The wet streets reflected the pale winter light. We passed through several familiar parts of London, and gradually the conversation turned away from the case, but the memory of Yoxley Old Place remained with me. I found myself thinking about Professor Coram. He had spent many years rebuilding his life. He had become a respected scholar. He lived quietly. He surrounded himself with books. To an ordinary observer, he might have appeared to be nothing more than an eccentric academic, yet beneath that appearance was the history of a man who had betrayed his companions. The past had remained hidden until Anna came looking for him. It reminded me of something Holmes had often demonstrated. A person might conceal a fact from other people. He might even conceal it from himself for a time, but the consequences of that fact did not disappear. They remained, and eventually circumstances might bring them back. Professor Coram had lived for years, believing that the old events were finished. He had escaped Russia. He had changed his name. He had built a new life, yet the papers had remained. Anna had remained, and the memory of Alexis had remained. The past had been waiting quietly. Then one morning, a woman wearing golden pince-nez had appeared at the house. Everything had begun again. I also thought about Willoughby Smith. He had been entirely outside the old conflict. He had not known Anna. He had not known Alexis. He had not been involved in Russian politics. He had simply been a young secretary doing his work, yet he had become the victim of a history that had nothing to do with him. That was perhaps the saddest part of the entire affair. There had been no hatred between Anna and Willoughby. There had been no deliberate intention to harm him. One moment of fear had been enough. Holmes had understood this. He had not allowed the circumstances to become more dramatic, and they truly were. The truth was painful, precisely because it was so ordinary. A frightened woman had struck out. A young man had fallen, and an entire investigation had followed. By the time we reached Baker Street again, the afternoon was fading. The fire was still warm. I settled into my chair. Holmes stood beside the mantelpiece, looking thoughtful. For some time neither of us spoke. Then I asked him whether he considered the case unusual. He smiled. He said that every case was unusual if one examined it closely enough, but the golden pince-nez had presented an especially interesting problem. The evidence had been there from the beginning. It had simply required interpretation. The pince-nez had told him about the woman's eyesight. The scratch had told him why she had entered the study. The grass had suggested that she had not escaped by the obvious route. The corridors explained her mistake. The professor's appetite suggested another person in his room. The cigarette ash proved movement, and the bookcase supplied the hiding place. Nothing had been mysterious once. Each clue had been placed in its proper position. That was Holmes's great gift. He could see relationships between things that appeared unrelated. A pair of spectacles was connected to a patch of grass. A patch of grass was connected to a corridor. A corridor was connected to a hidden room. A hidden room was connected to a professor's unusual meals, and of meals eventually revealed the woman. I had witnessed this process many times, yet I never ceased to admire it. As evening came, Holmes returned the empty envelope to his desk. The case was finished. There was nothing more for us to do. I remember sitting beside the fire that night and thinking about how differently the story might have ended. Had Anna not lost her spectacles, she might have escaped. Had she escaped, Holmes might never have discovered her identity. Had the professor not hidden her, she might have been arrested immediately. Had Willoughby Smith arrived a minute later, he might have lived. So much depended upon moments. A few seconds could alter an entire life. That was another lesson I had learned from my years with Holmes. Human beings often imagine that great events arise from great causes. Sometimes they do. But sometimes history turns upon something as small as a lost pair of spectacles. The night deepened for London. Rain began once more. Against the windows, Holmes had taken up his violin. He played softly, almost absent-mindedly. The notes filled the room with a gentle melancholy. I sat quietly and listened. My thoughts returned to Anna. Whatever judgment history might pass upon her actions, I could not forget her final expression. She had been exhausted. She had known that her life was ending. Yet she had been calm because the papers were safe. She had trusted Holmes to complete the final task, and he had done so. The case therefore ended not with a grand celebration, but with a promise kept. Perhaps that was fitting. Holmes's work had never been about glory. It was about truth. He had found the truth at Yoxley Old Place. He had uncovered a murder. He had discovered a hidden woman. He had exposed an old betrayal. And finally, he had carried out the last request of a dying stranger. As I watched the fire burn lower, I realized why the case had remained so vivid in my memory. It was not merely the mystery. It was the chain of human choices behind it. A young woman had once trusted a man. That trust had been betrayed. She had endured years of punishment. She had continued to remember someone she believed had been unjustly condemned. She had searched for evidence. She had crossed borders. She had entered an English country house. And everything had ended beneath the quiet light of a bedroom fire. The golden pince-nez had been the beginning of our understanding, but they had also become a symbol of the case. They represented how little things can reveal great truths. Holmes had once told me that the world was full of obvious things which nobody ever observed. I had often wondered at that statement. After Yoxley Old Place, I understood it better. The truth had been lying openly before us. We simply had not known what it meant. The pince-nez had been visible. The scratch had been visible. The disturbed ash had been visible. The bookcase had been visible. The truth had been present from the start. Only Holmes had been able to assemble it. The fire had almost burned out when Holmes finally put aside his violin. He looked across at me. The case, he said, was finished. I agreed. Outside, London had become quiet. The rain softened the sounds of the street. The gas lamps shone through the mist, and for a while, Baker Street seemed peaceful again. Yet somewhere beyond the familiar streets, the story of Alexis was still unfolding. Perhaps the documents would help him. Perhaps they would change his fate. That outcome was no longer in our hands. But Anna had done what she believed she had to do. Holmes had done what he had promised. And I, for my part, had witnessed one more strange chapter in the long history of Sherlock Holmes. Little did I know at the time how often I would return in memory to that quiet evening when the last evidence The golden pince-nez had finally been placed safely beyond our reach. The rain continued through the evening. From my chair beside the fire at Baker Street, I could hear the soft sound of drops against the window. London had disappeared behind a curtain of darkness and mist. The familiar lamps of Baker Street showed only as blurred circles of gold. Holmes had become unusually quiet. The case was finished. There was nothing more to discover at Yoxley Old Place, yet I knew that his mind was still occupied with the events of the previous day. Holmes rarely allowed himself much sentiment, but he was not without feeling. Behind his calm manner, there was a deep respect for courage, intelligence, and loyalty. The story of Anna had contained all three. She had endured years of hardship because she believed that a wrong had been committed. She had never forgotten Lexus. She had never accepted the account given by the authorities, and when she finally learned where the evidence had been hidden, she had crossed the country to recover it. Her plan had been simple. She would enter the house, she would take the papers, she would leave. Nothing in her plan required violence. Nothing suggested that she wished to harm Willoughby Smith. The tragedy had come from a sudden encounter. That distinction remained important to Holmes. A murder had occurred, but the circumstances were very different from those of a planned killing. Willoughby had been a young man caught in an unexpected situation. Anna had been a woman desperate to escape. A few seconds of confusion had changed both their lives. I thought of the young secretary as I sat beside the fire. He'd been doing his ordinary work. He had no knowledge of the old political struggle. He had never met Alexis. He had no reason to understand why a stranger had entered his employer's study. His final moments must have been filled with confusion. Yet, even then, he had tried to communicate what he knew. His final words had provided another small piece of the puzzle. Holmes had understood them. That was one of the things I admired most about my old companion. He never regarded a dying man's confused words as meaningless, simply because they were incomplete. He considered the circumstances. He remembered the earlier encounter. He connected the words with the woman seen near the house. Then he waited for the remaining evidence. The solution had not come from one brilliant guess. It had come gradually. That was perhaps the best lesson of the entire affair. People often imagined that Holmes solved cases through some mysterious instinct. I knew better. His method was patient. He observed. He compared. He questioned. He rejected assumptions. Most importantly, he noticed when something did not fit. The golden pince-nez represented the perfect example. They were small. They were delicate. They could easily have been dismissed as an ordinary personal possession, but Holmes immediately understood that they belonged to a woman of exceptionally poor eyesight. That one fact changed the entire case. It made the gardens suspicious. It made the escape route doubtful. It suggested that the woman might still be somewhere within the house. From there, Holmes followed the evidence until the hidden room was discovered. The case had therefore begun with something almost invisible to ordinary attention, a pair of spectacles. I had seen many such moments during my years with Holmes. A cigar ash, a footprint, a stain upon a sleeve, a forgotten word, an unusual habit. To most people, these were meaningless. To Holmes, they were fragments of a larger picture. But even Holmes could not change the outcome once the truth had been discovered. That was another lesson the case had taught me. Knowledge does not always bring happiness. Sometimes the truth arrives too late. Willoughby Smith could not be brought back. Anna could not be saved. The years of suffering experienced by Alexis could not simply be erased, and Professor Coram could not undo what he had done in Russia. Holmes could uncover the truth. He could place the evidence in the proper hands. He could perhaps help Alexis, but he could not restore the past. This was something I had learned repeatedly as a physician. There are moments when skill can save a life. There are others when all that remains is to understand what has happened and offer whatever comfort is still possible. The same was true of Holmes' work. He could solve the mystery, but sometimes the mystery ended in sadness. That night, the fire slowly burned lower. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers resting upon his knees. For a while we listened to the rain. Then he rose and went to the mantelpiece. He took the golden pince-nez from the small evidence case. He held them beneath the light. The delicate golden frame caught the glow from the lamp. I had seen those spectacles lying upon the table in the study. At the beginning of the investigation, they had seemed almost ridiculous compared with the seriousness of the murder. Now they seemed like the key to everything. Holmes examined them once more. Then he returned them to the case. He remarked that a detective must be careful never to decide what a clue means before examining all the surrounding circumstances. The glasses had not told him who the woman was. They had not revealed her name. They had not explained her motive. They had simply told him something about her physical condition. The rest had to be discovered. That distinction was important. A clue does not solve a case by itself. It opens a door. The detective must then have the patience to walk through it. I smiled at this. It sounded very much like Holmes. He had always disliked conclusions that were reached too quickly. He preferred a chain of reasoning in which each link supported the next. In the golden pince-nez case, the chain had been unusually clear once it was complete. A woman had entered the house. She had poor eyesight. She had lost her spectacles. She had not escaped through the garden. She had gone to the wrong passage. She had reached Professor Coram. He had hidden her. The hidden woman explained his unusual behavior. Her presence explained the disturbed ash. Her purpose explained the locked cupboard. The documents explained the motive. And the whole story led back to a betrayal that had occurred many years earlier. Nothing had been wasted. Every important detail had found its place. That was why the case had remained memorable. The mystery had not been solved by a single dramatic discovery. It had been solved by patience. I often think that this is the quality of Holmes that people understood least. His brilliance was obvious. His patience was not. He could sit for an hour beside a window without speaking. He could study a small object for several minutes. He could listen to an apparently insignificant account and remember every detail. He was willing to wait until the facts formed their own pattern. I had sometimes been impatient with him. Looking back, I see that I was often impatient because I wanted the answer before the evidence was ready. Holmes never made that mistake. The following morning, the case was formally placed in the hands of the authorities. Holmes had completed his responsibility. The documents Anna had entrusted to him had been delivered as promised. Her final request had not been forgotten. Whatever became of Alexis afterward belonged to another chapter of history, but the papers were now beyond Professor Coram's control. The truth had been given a chance to speak. I remember asking Holmes whether he regretted that Anna had taken her own life. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that regret was natural, but that it was not the same as judgment. Anna had made her choice. She had been exhausted by years of suffering. She had completed the task that had brought her to England, and in the end, she had trusted Holmes to carry the evidence forward. He would honor that trust. There was nothing more to add. We returned to our ordinary life at Baker Street. The newspapers soon moved on to other matters. London had no shortage of crimes, scandals, political disputes, and fashionable events. The death of a young secretary in a quiet country house became only one story among many, but I did not forget it. Perhaps because I had been present when the mystery was solved. Perhaps because I had seen the human beings behind the clues. Or perhaps because the case reminded me that the past is rarely as distant as we imagine. A secret may remain hidden for years. A betrayal may seem forgotten. A letter may lie unread in a drawer. A pair of spectacles may rest upon a table. But then one day, something happens, and suddenly, the past returns. That was what happened at Yoxley Old Place. A woman came looking for old papers. A young man entered a room. A pair of golden pince-nez fell to the floor. And from those small events came the discovery of an entire forgotten history. I've often wondered what became of the old house afterward. Perhaps the servants remained. Perhaps another scholar eventually occupied the rooms. Perhaps the study was cleaned and the furniture rearranged. But to me, the house would always remain connected with that quiet investigation. I could still picture the narrow garden path. I could still see the wet grass. I could still imagine a dim study and the locked bureau. I could still see the bookcase moving slowly aside, and behind it, a tired woman stepping into the light. These memories have remained with me for many years. Holmes himself rarely spoke about the case afterward. That was typical of him. Once a mystery had been solved, he was ready to move on. There were always other problems waiting. Other people needed help. Other strange events required explanation. His mind was constantly turning toward the next question, but I remained more sentimental. I kept the memory. I remembered Anna's courage. I remembered Willoughby Smith's tragic fate. I remembered the old professor sitting beside the fire, and above all, I remembered Holmes examining that delicate golden frame. It seemed to me then, as it does now, that the spectacles represented something larger than the mystery. They reminded me that truth often lies close at hand. We overlook it because it appears too small. We search for grand explanations when the answer may be resting quietly before us. Holmes taught me otherwise. Look carefully. Question every assumption. Follow each fact. And never decide too quickly that an insignificant detail has no value. The golden pince-nez remained one of the finest examples of that principle. Years have passed since that winter investigation. Much has changed. The London of my youth has faded. The gas lamps have grown dim in memory. The carriages have become part of another age. Even Baker Street sometimes seems to belong to a distant dream. Yet when I think of those evenings with Holmes, the memories remain remarkably clear. I can still hear the rain against the window. I can still smell the smoke from his pipe. I can still see the fire reflected in the glass, and I can still remember the quiet satisfaction with which he placed the final clue beside all the others. There was never anything theatrical about Holmes when he had reached the truth. He did not celebrate. He simply knew, and perhaps that was why I trusted him so completely. He followed truth wherever it led, even when it led into painful places, even when the answer brought no happiness, even when solving the mystery meant discovering a tragedy rather than preventing one. The golden pince-nez was such a case. It began with a death. It continued with a mystery. It uncovered a hidden life. It ended with a promise. That promise was kept. The papers were delivered. The truth was preserved, and the story finally came to rest. Tonight, as I look back upon it, I do not think first of the murder. I think of the quiet details, the winter garden, the wet grass, the faint light in the study, the old books, the hidden room, the golden spectacles, and Sherlock Holmes standing calmly among them all, patiently fitting each fragment into place. That is how I remember the case. Not as a tale of violence, but as one of those strange and melancholy adventures in which the past reaches forward into the present, and where the smallest clue can open the door to a forgotten world. Perhaps that is why I've never forgotten the golden pince-nez. They were only spectacles, yet through them Holmes saw the truth. And through the truth, we came to understand the lives of those who had been caught within the mystery. The fire has almost gone out now. The rain has softened. London is quiet beyond my window. I find myself grateful for these peaceful evenings in which an old man may sit and remember the days when my friend and I walked through the foggy streets of London in search of answers. There were many cases. Some were stranger, some were more dangerous, some were more famous, but this one has always remained close to my memory because of the sadness hidden beneath its cleverness. The lesson was simple. Truth may be hidden for years, but it leaves traces. A person may disappear, but the consequences of their actions remain. And sometimes the smallest object can tell us where to begin. For Sherlock Holmes, the golden pince-nez had been such an object. For me, they became the symbol of a case I would remember long after the details had faded. The fire is now only embers. The house is silent. And the old memories are once again returning to their proper place. So let us leave Yoxley Old Place behind us, with its secrets finally uncovered and its troubled history brought into the light. May the night be peaceful, may the past remain where it belongs, and may tomorrow bring quieter dreams. Until we meet again, my dear friend, good night.